coming. I do appreciate this. I know there's other places you could be, other things you could be doing. I'm just curious, are there other, who is a student member of Phi Kappa Phi here? Do we have some? We have two. Well, thank you for being here. Yeah, I've actually given this talk once before. The last time was in a much, much larger room, and I was wearing my pajamas. And I was really happy to wake up, because I very seldom have had a nightmare about a talk that I've given ever before, because I like doing this sort of thing. But I had a nightmare about this one because I haven't had quite as much time to prepare for it as I would have liked to, because ironically, things got hard. But I promised to refund you twice the cost of your admission fee if you're disappointed. And I also sort of warn you in advance, I have a suspicion that at the end of the day, I won't be telling you anything you don't already know, which is what I often feel like when I give a talk. I feel like basically what I'm doing is I'm sort of repackaging things that everyone already knows, but we'll get to there at the end. This is, of course, Phi Kappa Phi. And Phi Kappa Phi, being an honor society, is composed of people who've been sort of recognized officially for being smart. And that's wonderful. I was actually initiated into Phi Kappa Phi when I was an undergraduate at Moorhead State University. It was then called, it's now called Minnesota State University Moorhead, an institution very similar to this one in size and mission. I was a mathematics student at that time, as Dr. Ruppel mentioned. And my mother was actually a math professor there. And I grew up on a college campus surrounded by professors and sort of like-minded individuals. And of course, those kinds of people tend to really value intelligence a lot. So actually, I think I was lucky. I gather that many little girls, when they're growing up, have their parents' friends tell them, oh, you're so pretty. For whatever reason, I didn't get that very much, maybe because I wasn't very pretty, but what I got a lot more was people would tell my mother in my presence as a way of complimenting me, sort of in the third person, oh, your daughter is so smart. And invariably, I can still hear her say this. My mother would say, yes, and she's nice, and that's more important. Now, I'm telling you this story not really as any kind of self-congratulations, because I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I am sure I'm nice. I can say that with some confidence for interesting reasons. I think I know what niceness feels like from the inside. I think I know what that looks like from the inside. It has to do with wishing people well and doing the best to foster the well-being of others and having good intentions and all of that stuff. So I can say with some confidence that I'm nice, but I can't say with any confidence that I'm smart at all, because I have no earthly idea what that looks like from the inside. I have no idea. And in fact, worse than that, when I introspect, I don't see smartness anywhere. I don't know what to look for. I certainly don't see it. If I see anything, what I see is sort of a bumbling attempt to find words, false starts in arguments, half-baked ideas that I look at and then sort of abandon. I don't see smartness in that way. But I tell you that story about what my mother said, primarily to illustrate a way of thinking about the relationship between these two ideas, between smart and nice, or smartness and niceness, right? And two things were apparent to me from this. First of all, of course, nice is more important than smart. And more importantly, they are very different things. And my mother was not alone in thinking that. She didn't know it, but she had some philosophical support. Immanuel Kant, in particular, wrote this: nothing can be possibly conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification except a good will. Intelligent wit, judgment, and the other talents of mind are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may all become extremely bad and mischievous if the will which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called their character, is not good. And I apologize for reading that to you, but otherwise I would just be sitting here bored as you read it yourself. So, Kant, now, when Kant said goodwill, he did not mean niceness. Just this is kind of an off-label use of Kant. But the insight is still there, that there's something called character or goodwill or niceness, broadly construed, which is not the same thing as intellect, but which is more important than it. And I think in some ways that's kind of intuitive. Now I was really hoping that there would be more students here, because then I would feel more comfortable asking sort of the questions that I ask in class, like, can you explain why perhaps intelligence without a goodwill is not a good thing? But I don't feel comfortable doing that with the class, with the group that's largely my colleagues, so I won't. But obviously, presumably you can see that, right? If you have someone who's really smart, you want that person to be really nice. The last thing in the world you want is someone who's smart and evil. That's like the worst. Better sort of ineffectively nice than really effective and evil. Now, actually, that distinction between nice and smart and the relative priority of those two things is sort of, I mean, certainly the entirety of my professional life, and probably before that, has been sort of floating around the backstage of my mind, and I come back to it routinely, and I think about it, and I worry about it, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. But what I want you to do right now is just to sort of make a mental bookmark there, that notion of smart and nice. And in fact, maybe to assist that, I don't know if you can see this very well because of the lighting, but I'm just going to write this here. Smart versus nice. Right, that's an important point that we'll be coming back to. But one of the reasons that I tend to obsess about that issue, of course, is because I'm a philosopher, and that's exactly the kind of issue that philosophers tend to puzzle about a lot. So, what is philosophy? Now, if this room had been filled with all the students that I was hoping would be here, I would say, what is philosophy? Let's take apart the word. What does philo mean? What does Sophie mean? But, I will, because actually Josh Warren is here and his daughter is named Sophie. So, what's Sophie mean?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. Good. And so then what does philo mean? Love. Yeah. So, philosophy, if we just take the word apart, is the love of wisdom, but that's not terribly informative. One of the definitions that I like of philosophy is from Bertrand Russell, who says it's something intermediate between theology and science. Like theology, he says, philosophy is largely speculative, and we don't have definite knowledge. But like science, it appeals to human reason. I'm not that fond of that definition. I like the spirit of it. The letter of it, I'm not too sure I like, because it presupposes that there's no definite knowledge in theology. And insofar as theology is to some extent definitional, I think that's about the only place you're ever going to get anything like definite knowledge. And it also presupposes that there is definite knowledge in science, which I also am not too sure that's the case. I mean, if that were, it seems like we could just put a period on it and be done and never need to have any more research or change our minds, and that's obviously not how it works. So when comma, put a comma. But why a comma, Dean Servo?
Because there's always more to the story.
There's always more. Oh, I see. But there's also revisions to previous versions of the story, right? That's what we love about science. That's what makes science great. So, although I like the spirit of this, and I don't like really the letter of it, when I teach my students, I try to capture the spirit of it in a slightly different way. I say that philosophy is the activity of considering questions that can't be answered empirically. So it's not science. If it's a question that you can answer by, running an experiment or doing a survey or looking out the window, it's not philosophy. But it does address them by thinking rationally. So you can't just think whatever you want and be done with it. And when I was writing my dissertation, can't remember what chapter 2 is about, but I do remember that there was a problem in chapter 2. And my aunt, who'd never studied philosophy, called me up, and like she always did because she lived in the same town, and said, how's the dissertation going? Which is something you should never ask anyone who's writing a dissertation. And I said, oh, not so well, I have a problem with chapter 2. And she said, well, what do you mean it's a problem with chapter 2? And I said, well, it's not working out. It doesn't work. And she said, what do you mean it doesn't work? It's philosophy, can't you just say whatever you want to say? And no, you can't just say whatever you want to say. you have to think rationally, and if the argument doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I tried to explain that, and I said, it's sort of like a petri dish. I put something in the petri dish, and I was hoping mold would grow, and it didn't grow, so I have to sort of start over. So you do think rationally. Now, the thing about this definition, though, is it does restrict the sort of domain of discourse of philosophy to things that aren't empirical. And a lot of people today, I think, value, sort of idolize the empirical and science to such an extent that one might wonder, well, then why bother with philosophy? If it asks questions like, does God exist? What's the meaning of life? If we're never going to know for sure because we can't run a test, what's the use of it? Well, I think this is the use of it, and this is where the title comes in. I think that philosophy helps us to think about things when things get hard. For example, ethics, making ethical decisions. Suppose that, and again, I apologize, I wrote this largely for students who I thought were going to be here, but the example is, suppose that you want to buy a really expensive sweater that you don't need, it costs $150. Is it okay or not to steal the money from your roommate to buy the sweater? And the answer, of course, is, don't play philosopher, just tell me what you really know. Is that okay or not? No. Good. You don't need philosophy there. And in fact, philosophy, when I said don't play philosopher, that's because sometimes when people are playing philosopher, they try to say the thing that's just the most outrageous thing, justify it. Right? No, intuitively, we know that's the wrong thing to do. Now, suppose you win $10 million and your cousin loses his house in a tornado. Is it the right thing or the wrong thing to help your cousin rebuild the house? Now again, don't play philosopher, just what is the right thing to do? Is that the right thing or the wrong thing?
Depends.
How come? You're playing philosopher.
Sorry. Can't resist, I'm around one all day.
Yeah. I would say that it's the right thing to do if your cousin had, the tornado took his house and he's homeless and you have a lot of money. Yeah, pony up, help your cousin to get a new house. But now suppose that you're a doctor and your son or daughter is friends with a neighbor kid named Pat. And Pat's parents have a religious objection to seeking any kind of medical attention. Pat comes on a family vacation with you and your kids, and you diagnose sort of visually this child, Pat, with potentially life-threatening illness. Maybe there's about a 40% chance of dying. It's not a sure thing, but it's worrisome. And you know that you can cure this child with the one-time administration of a water-soluble, tasteless medicine. Do you spike Pat's drink? Just shake some of it in Pat's lemonade. Pat drinks the lemonade and is cured of this disease, even knowing that her parents have religious objections.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Suppose that Pat has attained the age of reason and is now 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. At what age does?
I was kidding.
Oh, I know, but honestly, I'm not sure. My first reaction was when I'm thinking of Pat as a 2-year-old, absolutely. But what if Pat's 12-year-old? What if Pat's 18? That's when it gets hard. I don't think that's like the sweater example or the building the home example. That's when things get hard. And that's when philosophy helps you to think about them. It helps you to think about them when you need help thinking. It also helps us to appreciate that sometimes things are harder than we think they are. For example, agreeing to disagree. We say this all the time. Oh, well, we disagree. You think one thing, I think another, let's agree to disagree. But let's unpack that for just a moment. Let's suppose that you're a theist and your friend is an atheist. Or if you feel more comfortable, switch those. You're the atheist, your friend's a theist, I don't care. Suppose that you consider your friend to be at least as intelligent and rational as you are, okay? And suppose that after many years of sharing arguments, you are no closer to agreement than you were before. This is when often people think, well, we'll just agree to disagree. But let's look at that. So take a look at B and C. If you really consider your friend to be as reasonable as you are, as capable of assessing the evidence as you are, and if you have pooled your evidence, as we say in C, and your friend continues to disagree with you, why shouldn't that weaken your confidence that you're right and maybe make you less of a theist, A? Contrary, suppose that you stick to your guns and you're a theist and you share your evidence, shouldn't that lead you to think that your friend maybe isn't quite as reasonable and intelligent as you are because your friend can't quite assess the force of the evidence as you do? holding all of these points simultaneously is something that people think, oh, it's easily done. And I think that's disastrous, actually. This is the paradox of rational disagreement. That's another thing I'd like you to bookmark, because we're going to come back to that, so I'll write this too. Rational disagreement. So, if philosophy helps us to think about things when things get hard, and if it helps us to appreciate that things are often harder than they seem, how can things, what are some of the ways that things can get hard? Philosophy can also help us to think about that. Philosophy tends to divide hard things into two kinds: natural evil and moral evil. These are terms that come particularly from the philosophy of religion. Evil is not the most appropriate term here, I think. I tend to use suffering, but in the literature they call it evil, so I'm going to continue that. Natural evil are things like the tornado that took out your cousin's house in the previous example. It's stuff that happens through nobody's fault. Natural disasters, that kind of thing. Moral evil is exactly what we normally mean by evil. It's, instead of a tornado coming and taking out your cousin's house, your cousin's bitter ex-partner torches the house, right? And kills all the pets. That's moral evil. That's a bad thing that happens sort of on purpose. Now, we know that happens. We directly experience evil in that sense. We directly experience bad things happen. So that's not a question. The only question is, how should we think about them? I think that this question of how should we think about them falls into two general kinds of questions. The first question is, how can we reconcile the bad things that happen with other beliefs that we have? Now, what other belief might we have that would be potentially pressured by our awareness or our acknowledgement of natural evil? Now I am going to be the professor. I mean, why would this cause any kind of cognitive dissonance